The world calls them legends, icons, kings of black music. Names etched into vinyl history books and cultural memory. But inside their own homes, many of these men were remembered very differently. From the 1950s through the 1990s, fame demanded total devotion, and family was often the first thing taken. While audiences witnessed confidence, genius, and command on stage, their children grew up with absence, fear, neglect, or violence, raised by exhausted mothers, rotating caretakers, or long stretches of silence. Applause taught an early lesson: success could drown out responsibility. These fathers were celebrated everywhere, except at the dinner table, where promises collapsed, tempers ruled, and emotional distance slowly hardened into permanent scars. Over time, admiration curdled into resentment, and resentment into open hatred. Because children do not remember hit records. They remember empty rooms, missed birthdays, bruises never explained, a parent who belonged to the world but not to them. This is not a tribute. This is an investigation into 10 black music legends whose fame transformed them into strangers inside their own families, and the painful secrets history rarely confronts. 1. James Brown. Power at home. Fear in the hallways. By the mid-1970s, James Brown's authority in public life was absolute. Privately, according to multiple family accounts, that authority extended into his homes in Georgia and South Carolina, where rules were enforced through money, intimidation, and punishment. Brown acknowledged at least 9 children with different partners, and several later described a household governed less by routine than by volatility. His son Teddy Brown, born in 1964, said in later interviews that childhood meant constantly anticipating his father's mood. When Brown was present, the atmosphere shifted. Teddy described verbal humiliation, sudden rage, and physical discipline that left no room for explanation. Family members recalled that disagreements could trigger consequences far beyond scolding. Allowances were cut. Access was restricted. Isolation was used as leverage. Brown's wealth magnified his control. He paid the bills, decided who lived where, and could withdraw support without warning. Family recollections from the late 1970s and early 1980s repeatedly describe heated confrontations inside Brown's Georgia properties, arguments that escalated into physical force. Security staff were reportedly instructed to remove children from rooms when tempers flared. While details varied by account, the pattern did not. Obedience was expected. Dissent was punished. Several children said they learned early not to contradict him, not to ask questions, and not to seek comfort when anger filled the room. The contradiction cut deepest. On stage, Brown preached discipline as excellence. At home, discipline felt like threat. Teddy later said the most damaging outcome was not a single incident, but the constant anticipation of one, a stress that followed him into adulthood. Other children echoed the same feeling, describing anxiety, distrust of authority, and fractured sibling relationships built on competition for safety rather than affection. Legal records and press reports from 1988 through 2004 show Brown repeatedly arrested for violent or erratic behavior unrelated to his children, reinforcing family claims that volatility was not confined to one space. After his death in December 2006, disputes over his estate reopened old wounds. Several children challenged arrangements they said reflected the same unilateral control they had grown up under. Decisions made alone. Communication minimal. Trust absent. The long-term damage was measurable. Family members spoke about decades of estrangement, years of therapy, and the inability to separate admiration for Brown's music from fear of the man himself. One son summarized the divide with brutal clarity: a legend to the world, a nightmare at home. The harm was not abstract. It surfaced in broken contact legal battles and a generation raised to survive power rather than trust it. 2. Marvin Gaye. Love, faith, and a gunshot. On April 1, Marvin Gaye's family history was already marked by religious extremism and domestic violence long before fame ever entered the picture. His father, Marvin Gaye, a Pentecostal minister, enforced obedience through humiliation and physical punishment. Marvin grew up chasing approval. He rarely received learning early that affection could be withheld like a lesson. The conflict did not fade with adulthood. It followed him even as his career climbed higher, and his voice became a symbol of intimacy and healing. By the early 1980s, Marvin's mental health had deteriorated amid depression and paranoia. In 1983, he moved back into his parents' home in Los Angeles, a decision relatives later said carried danger given the unresolved abuse between father and son. Police records show repeated domestic disputes at the address. Friends reported shouting matches over money, religion, and control. The house wasn't a sanctuary. It was a pressure chamber sealed tight with years of resentment building behind every door. Then came April 1, 1984, one day before Marvin's 45th birthday. During an argument, Marvin Gaye shot his son twice with a handgun Marvin himself had previously given him. Marvin died at the scene. The coroner ruled the death a homicide. His father later pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter and received probation citing health issues. The headlines moved fast. The tributes came even faster. But inside the family, the moment didn't end. It lodged there. For Marvin's children, the aftermath was devastating and permanent. They lost their father in a way that confirmed the pattern they had feared: violence normalized, then unleashed. Public remembrance focused on artistry, but private grief was fused with terror. If something this unthinkable could happen once, what else could happen when anger was left to grow unchecked? Several of Marvin's children have spoken about living with anxiety, mistrust, and the burden of a legacy tied to bloodshed. The generational impact was visible in the years that followed: difficulty forming stable relationships, hypersensitivity to conflict, and long stretches of therapy, just to name what had happened without reliving it. Financially, the estate became a battleground, but the deeper cost was emotional. Birthdays that arrived with echoes of gunfire. Faith that felt less like comfort and more like control. Love permanently tangled with threat. Marvin's music preached healing and closeness. His home delivered the opposite. For his children, loving their father meant carrying the knowledge that the violence he endured and could not outrun ultimately killed him. The lesson they inherited was brutal and specific: when abuse is sanctified and ignored, it doesn't fade. It escalates. 3. Ike Turner. His children didn't learn love. They learned escape. By the late 1960s, the Turner household had become a place where survival mattered more than childhood. Ike Turner's children didn't grow up wondering what love was supposed to feel like. They learned how to recognize danger. Ronnie Turner, born in 1960 to Ike and Tina Turner, spent his earliest years hearing violence echo through walls in homes across Los Angeles and along the touring circuit. Tina later recalled being beaten before performances, dragged by her hair, punched until her face swelled. Ronnie saw what came after. He saw his mother cover injuries. He watched her move carefully, speak carefully, plan exits quietly. He learned early that silence was protection and invisibility was safety. Other children, including Ike Turner Jr. and Linda Tripper Turner, lived under the same shadow. Through the 1970s, cocaine reportedly fueled Ike's paranoia and rage, turning the house into what one family member later described as a constant state of alert. Arguments escalated quickly. Objects flew. Doors slammed. Children retreated into rooms and stayed there, listening for footsteps, listening for the tone in his voice. Love was conditional. Obedience was mandatory. The breaking point didn't come from one single incident. It came from accumulation, years stacked on top of each other until there was no space left to breathe. As the children grew older, they made choices that stunned outsiders, but felt inevitable to them. Some changed their last names. Some cut contact completely. Ronnie, despite remaining close to Tina, struggled with addiction himself, and later admitted that growing up surrounded by violence and instability left wounds he never fully escaped. The hatred wasn't loud at first. It arrived quietly expressed through distance, refusal, rejection. And when Ike Turner's reputation collapsed publicly in the 1980s and 1990s, his children did not rush to defend him. Some spoke openly, calling him a man who destroyed his family long before the world turned on him. Ike died in December 2007, reportedly alone, his legacy split between undeniable musical influence and personal ruin. For his children, the conclusion was simple, and cold genius did not cancel terror, and blood did not excuse harm. The final damage wasn't only emotional, it was generational. Trust, stability, and safety were casualties in a household where fear replaced love, and the children learned that the only way to survive their father was to leave him behind. For Ray Charles, 12 children and a lifetime of distance. Ray Charles built a public image of warmth, vulnerability, and emotional truth. His voice carried pain that felt intimate, almost confessional. But behind the music, his private life followed a colder design. Ray fathered 12 children with at least 9 women, including Ray Charles Jr., Sheila Ray Charles, Robert Robinson, Evelyn Robinson, and others whose relationships with him were shaped less by presence than by structure. Ray did not deny his children. He provided financial support, but he kept them separate, scheduled, and distant. Throughout the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, his children described a father who existed behind layers of assistants, handlers, and legal boundaries. Meetings were brief. Visits were supervised. Some later said they never once sat alone with him as a complete family. They didn't share holidays. They didn't build sibling bonds. Ray decided who saw him when and for how long. Emotion was regulated like an expense. Love was measured, contained, rationed. The resentment surfaced fully after Ray's death on June 10, 2004, in Los Angeles. As his estate entered probate, conflicts erupted. Children accused him of favoritism, emotional neglect, and deliberate separation. Ray Charles Jr. spoke publicly about loving his father, while admitting a painful truth: Ray had chosen control over connection. Others said they knew their father more through attorneys than through conversation. One child later remarked that the most consistent presence in their relationship was a contract. The anger was never really about money. It was about absence, missed birthdays, ignored milestones. A father who sang endlessly about feeling while rationing his own. The legal battles exposed what the music never revealed. Ray Charles built intimacy for the world while keeping his own children at arm's length. When he died, he left more than a catalogue. He left a family divided by years of emotional distance, proof that providing is not the same as parenting, and that silence can wound deeper than neglect ever admits. 5. Sam Cooke. Children left with questions, not a father. In the summer of 1963, Sam Cooke was still the sound of assurance. He smiled on television, sang about change, and carried himself like a man fully in control. But inside his private life, fractures were forming. The pressures were mounting in Los Angeles: lawsuits over publishing, growing expenses from multiple households, and relationships strained by affairs that created distance rather than intimacy. His children were young, too young to understand why their father was suddenly gone more often, too young to grasp why adults whispered when he entered a room, or why the warmth they once felt began to thin. Then on the night of December 11, 1964, that distance became permanent. Sam Cooke was shot and killed at the Hacienda Motel in Los Angeles. By the following morning, the death was ruled a justifiable homicide. The speed of the conclusion stunned the public and left the family reeling. For his children, there was no clear explanation, no grounding truth that made sense to a child. Just a headline that replaced a father overnight. As the years passed, they grew up surrounded by fragments. Different versions of the story circulated from managers, relatives, journalists. None complete. None consistent. They learned the address where their father died before they learned why. Birthdays came with his voice on the radio and silence at the table. The anger that followed did not harden into hatred of Sam Cooke himself. It rose toward the adults who decided truth was optional, toward the silence that replaced explanation. By adulthood, that silence had shaped everything. Trust became fragile. Family bonds weakened under the weight of unanswered questions. The children of Sam Cooke did not inherit closure. They inherited uncertainty, a legacy wrapped in secrecy. The lesson settled slowly, and permanently losing a parent is devastating, but being denied the truth about how and why they died can wound a family for life. 6. Michael Jackson. Children raised behind glass. On February 13, 1998, Michael Jackson introduced his first child to the world. Cameras flashed. Security closed ranks. From the beginning, his children lived inside a sealed environment designed to protect them from danger and exposure. They grew up between Neverland and guarded homes around Los Angeles, where every movement was planned, every outing supervised, and every unfamiliar face treated as a potential threat. Michael was affectionate, attentive, and fiercely protective. According to those close to the family, he believed isolation was safety. But the world he built around his children was narrow and relentless. Privacy was rare. Normal childhood mistakes carried global consequences. And when Michael died on June 25, 2009, that world collapsed overnight. His children lost their father and inherited the full weight of his legacy at once. For Paris Jackson, the pressure became overwhelming. In the years that followed, she spoke publicly about depression and emotional distress, describing the exhaustion of being watched from early childhood. She talked about growing up without privacy, without ordinary friendships, and without the freedom to fail quietly. Her conflict remained unresolved. She loved her father and defended him while also acknowledging that the life surrounding him had taken something from her. She mourned two losses, at the same time the parent who adored her and the childhood she never fully experienced. The pain did not accuse Michael Jackson of cruelty. It exposed the cost of raising children inside a fortress built by fame. Images lingered in the public mind: guarded gates, trembling interviews, a young woman carrying a history far larger than herself. The truth left behind was simple and unsettling. Love alone cannot shield children from a world that never stops watching. Sometimes the greatest casualty of a legend's life is not the legend, but the children who grew up inside it. 7. R. Kelly. The daughter who erased her father. In January 2018, Joanne Kelly made a decision she had been circling for years. Sitting alone in a small Los Angeles apartment, she typed a sentence she knew would detonate once released. There was no metaphor, no softening, just a daughter drawing a line she would never step back across. Joanne, born in 1998, grew up watching the world celebrate a man she knew only in fragments. Her father existed mostly on screens in courtrooms and in rumors whispered by adults who avoided her eyes. As allegations against R. Kelly intensified through the 2000s, Joanne was still a child. She was not protected from the headlines. She was consumed by them. Classmates repeated accusations. Strangers asked questions no child should face. At home, silence filled the space where explanations should have been. By her late teens, the pressure became unbearable. Joanne stopped using her father's last name. She introduced herself simply as Joanne. She refused financial support, even when it was offered quietly, privately, as if money could replace accountability. Friends noticed she corrected people when they mentioned him. She did not defend. She did not explain. She closed the door. The rejection was not symbolic. It showed up in action. Contact was cut. Numbers were blocked. Intermediaries were turned away. She declined interviews that framed her as collateral damage. When she finally spoke publicly, she did so on her own terms, describing a childhood poisoned by association, a life permanently tethered to accusations she did not create, but could not escape. Loving her father would have required denying the pain of those who came forward. She chose not to. The backlash was immediate. Some accused her of betrayal. Others demanded loyalty because of blood. Joanne did not respond. Her refusal was the message. She later made it clear that the anger was not born overnight. It was built from years of watching powerful adults protect a powerful man while children absorbed the fallout. By severing ties publicly, Joanne accepted permanent loss financial security, a version of family that might have existed. What she gained was distance from a legacy that had become unbearable. The truth she left behind was devastating in its simplicity. Sometimes a child does not reject a parent out of cruelty. Sometimes rejection is the only way to survive. 8. Donny Hathaway. The father, the system let fade away. On January 13, 1979, Donny Hathaway died after falling from a hotel window in New York City. He was 33 years old. Headlines closed the case quickly, but for his daughters the story never ended. Hathaway had been living with severe mental illness, a diagnosis known to people around him, yet rarely acknowledged publicly while he was alive. By the mid-1970s, his behavior had grown increasingly erratic. Sessions were disrupted. Trust eroded. Instead of sustained care, he was labeled difficult. His daughters were young when the illness tightened its grip. They did not understand diagnoses or systems. They understood absence. They watched adults argue in lowered voices. They saw their father retreat behind closed doors, then return changed, frightened, distant. Treatment was inconsistent. Rest was treated like failure. Work continued while stability did not. After his death, confusion hardened into anger not toward their father, but toward the industry and institutions that allowed him to unravel in public without meaningful intervention. As they grew older, the question sharpened: how does a man with documented illness end up alone? Instead of protected, how does talent become an excuse for neglect? They challenged romanticized narratives. They corrected journalists. They refused to let his death be framed as inevitability rather than abandonment. The resentment, when it surfaced, aimed at silence, at the refusal to treat illness as illness. The truth was cruel and precise. Donny Hathaway's daughters did not lose their father to music or madness alone. They lost him to a system that chose convenience over care. 9. Curtis Mayfield. Survival and the family that paid the price. On August 13, 1990, during a rehearsal in Brooklyn, a sudden storm caused lighting equipment to fall, leaving Curtis Mayfield paralyzed from the neck down. He survived, and life transformed into hospital rooms, rotating caregivers and schedules, rebuilt around medical necessity. At first, the family rallied. Love filled the room. Exhaustion followed close behind. As years passed, the burden stopped feeling temporary. Bills grew. Care intensified. Time was measured by procedures, not holidays. What hardened into resentment wasn't Curtis's condition, but the narrowing of responsibility onto a few shoulders. Decisions felt unilateral. Access uneven. Arguments flared over care plans and finances, then went quiet, then returned sharper. Love didn't vanish. It turned brittle. Missed visits became deliberate. Calls went unanswered. Some children argued for professional care, not to abandon him, but because they could not carry the load anymore. Those choices were read as betrayal. By the time Curtis died on December 26, 1999, the family had spent nearly a decade in survival mode. Grief arrived tangled with relief, anger, and debt. Some spoke later about loving their father while resenting the years that consumed their own lives. The lesson was uncomfortable caregiving can erode even strong bonds when it is endless and underfunded. Survival is not victory when the cost is the family itself. 10 Prince. No children. No will. A family left outside the gate. Prince built his life like a fortress. From the mid-1980s on, access narrowed. Friends needed permission. Family needed appointments. Paisley Park became a sealed world where control meant safety, and safety justified isolation. He had no surviving children, but blood still waited outside the walls, calling and visiting often without reply. When Prince died on April 21, 2016 at Paisley Park in Minnesota, the silence cracked. He left no will. Overnight relatives he had kept at arm's length were pulled into a public legal battle. Lawyers replaced conversations that never happened. Grief unfolded in court filings. Resentment took shape through action. Family members challenged decisions, contested authority, and spoke openly about years of limited contact. The anger was aimed less at his death than at the rules that kept them strangers while he lived. Control had become a wall, and the wall outlasted him. As probate stretched on, relationships frayed. The public saw greed. The family felt reckoning. Every argument returned to the same wound. Distance left no room to resolve anything before time ran out. Prince's legacy remains pristine on record sleeves. Offstage, it is complicated by absence, no will to translate intention, only a family forced to argue in public for a place in a life they were never allowed to share. Looking back at these stories, one truth refuses to soften with time. Fame didn't just fail these families. It often stood between parents and children, like a wall no one was allowed to climb. Some children chose silence. Some chose distance. Some chose words as sharp as anger. Every response came from the same place: wounds applause could never heal. When a legend hurts their own blood, where should history land it?